I think we're going to have to find versions of that in our society where we can go to people and we can say, this is the brand that this person has created. How do we then go and find out what's behind the brand? What's the reality? And we've done very poorly at it in the last few elections because we've been willing to say everything behind the brand doesn't really matter. Their personal life, we don't care. Their values, we don't care. But I think we could get around to where we say, we want to weigh those.
Welcome back, amazing people, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Last episode, we talked about the big, beautiful bill and the problems with it. We talked about leaders that have or might be lacking in character. Today, we've got on a fascinating interview with retired General Stanley McCrystal, who was actually on the show in episode 75. And the reason we have General McCrystal on again, I'm incredibly grateful for his time, is because we talked last week about the big, beautiful bill. And today, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to have more effective leaders in Congress, in our government, and what it actually means for us as citizens to be better citizens. And General McCrystal actually has a book out called On Character: Choices That Define a Life, where he discusses specifically what it means to operate and live in a life with character. And in case you haven't watched episode 75, Stanley McCrystal is a retired four-star general. He was commander of the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan and previously served as commander of the nation's premier counterterrorism force, the Joint Special Operations Command. He's also the founder and CEO of McCrystal Group. And importantly, I'm a military nerd and military history nerd. And so I'm someone that has geeked out many times about General McChrystal's career and how he's approached the world. But importantly, Today, he actually offers a fascinating perspective on what it means to live a life of effective character. I hope everyone enjoys, and let's hear from General Stanley McCrystal. Thank you, everybody, and I'll catch you at the end of the conversation. General McCrystal, welcome back to The Hopeful Majority.
Well, Manu, call me Stan, please, and thanks for having me back.
Part of your book is about character, and one of the things that my mom always taught me was make sure you refer to someone by their formal name until they give you permission. So now that I've got you on record, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time. The listeners really appreciated listening to you last time, Stan, about how we can take from your experience and apply that to bridging divides. And now that you've got a new book out on character, the first question I have to ask you is, you have this very elegant formula in the book that character is convictions times discipline. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I was trained as an engineer, so I think in formulas.
Right.
But the way I came out on this one is convictions, which I really interpret as your values or your beliefs, but not just superficial ones, deeply held beliefs, ones you've actually thought about, ones you've pressure tested, things you're willing to live to or maybe die for. Those are those core things that you hold dear, and they're great. But you need another part of the equation, because discipline is the other part of it. Because if you have the greatest convictions in the world, but you lack the discipline to live to them, then you've got zero, because anything times zero is zero. So I think you need the two parts of that. And sometimes we celebrate convictions, but we lack the courage or the discipline to adhere to them.
So, as I told you right before you came on, I especially appreciated reading this book because I had actually just come out of a period of personal burnout, and I was looking for ways to think about how to structure my life moving forward. And one of the things that you started the book with was actually you submitting your resignation to President Obama after the Rolling Stone magazine article. And I think actually you wrote that it's a magazine that I don't read much, but it seemed to have altered my life. Can you speak a little bit to what it was like to have your identity challenged almost in such a public way, and how you went through the process of, as you talk about, renewing your identity over the years?
Yeah. For your listeners, because many won't be intimately familiar with that or remember it as clearly as I do.
Yeah.
I was in the military for all of my grown life. I was born in an Army hospital. My father was a soldier. My father's father was a soldier. I went at age 17 to West Point,
Mm.
graduated 4 years later, and then served the next more than 34 years as a commissioned officer. So everything about me was identified with being a soldier. It was what I enjoyed, what I cared deeply about. It was how I thought of myself. If you'd asked me, what are you? My reflexive response was, I'm a soldier.
Mm.
Now, I was a father, I was lots of other things, but at the core, I was a soldier. And what happened is I'd gone through a number of assignments, 3 wars and whatnot. Now I'm a 4-star general, which is the highest rank you can have. And so on that metric, I'd been successful. And I was commanding all forces in Afghanistan, about 150,000 coalition or Western forces, then about 300,000 Afghans. So it was a big job.
Yep.
And so I'm a commander, I'm a general, I'm a soldier. And a story came out in the Rolling Stone magazine by a freelance reporter. And it was a story that I didn't think was particularly accurate or fair, but that didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm responsible for what happened. So I offered my resignation to President Barack Obama. And he was gracious in our interaction, but he accepted it. So in an instant, after 38 plus years in uniform, suddenly I'm not a commander, I'm not a general, I'm not even a soldier. And so all of the things that I would have used to describe or define myself or to make myself feel good about myself were now gone, or at least in my mind they were.
Mm.
And I remember, because you start to figure out, if I'm not that, who am I? And if I'm not that, am I anything other than a disgraced general? Because this is the summer 2010, and I'm on the ticker of the news shows, the cable news shows, every 2 minutes.
Mm.
You know, my name, my 86-year-old father's watching this down in Tennessee, and that's just torturous for me to think about. My son was down at Florida State, and he's watching it, and I knew that had to be hard for him.
Yeah.
And so I'm wrestling with this question of, so who am I and what do I do about that or with that? And it took me a while to learn what I should have known all along. And that was, I wasn't any different than I was the moment before when I was all those things. You know, the same person was inside the uniform that was now inside other clothes.
Mm.
The character that I have or don't have is the same. And the great thing about it is it's my choice. That character is what I choose to be. And without pulling this on too long, I had studied Admiral James Stockdale, who is a naval aviator who'd been shot down early in the Vietnam War and spent 7 years in captivity. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his courage in captivity. But as he describes, he broke under torture and he made recordings that he swore he'd never do. So in one sense, by one metric, he was a failure. He failed to do what we tell American service members to do when they get captured. Now, it was unrealistic to expect that, but he still failed. And he dealt with that. He says, I can't control my physical conditions. I don't have my freedom. I don't have anything. And they have made me on one level of failure, but I do control my character. I control how I think about myself and how I treat other people. When you learn that basic lesson, you suddenly are kind of liberated because there's something nobody can take away. Only you can give it away. And that was, you know, it certainly took me to late in life to sort of come to that realization, but it became very empowering.
When you speak about character as something that no one can take away from you, and yet for 38 years, as you described, and before that, you perceived yourself as a soldier. So this was who you were. This was your identity, and suddenly it was not only stripped away, but there was a public scene to it, which I'm sure exacted a deep emotional toll. In fact, as I was reading your book, it seemed to me clear that your wife has played a significant role in your life and in the way in which you've overcome some of those obstacles. How do you go about overcoming that sort of identity fracture? Because that sense of my identity being tied to something outside of me is something that a lot of people today wrestle with, and in some ways a big cause of our political polarization. But we'll hold on that for a second. I'm just curious how you overcome that identity fracture.
Yeah, and I'm going to use 3 or 4 examples, so
Please, please.
bear with me. The first is your tendency is to care about what people think and to assume you know what people think. So soon after I left the service, if I had to travel, I went in an airport, I'd see people from across an area point at me and then whisper one person to another, and you always assume they're saying something bad about you.
Hmm.
And yet every time I interacted with someone, they were incredibly gracious. So most of that was in my mind. Everyone cared about what happened to Stan McCrystal. The reality is most people didn't care. And after 48 hours, most people didn't even remember.
Hmm.
But, in your own mind, you're the only person that's ever gone through this, and so you
We're
feel
each the
bad.
main character.
Exactly. And so there was that first part of it. And then as you start to define what that means, okay, if I am not the person that they think, who am I? What can I be? The people who do care about you come back and remind you what matters. What is it about you that they actually loved? My wife Annie reminded me it wasn't that she loved a general. She loved me. She didn't love just a soldier. She loved me. She cared. In fact, what she told me when I first told her that the president accepted my resignation was, good. We've always been happy and will always be happy. And if you think about that, in an instant, she validated our life to date. She said, I'm glad I married you. And the second is she validated our life in the future by saying, we will be happy. She didn't make it conditional. She said she was with me and we would be happy. And that's an extraordinary statement to make and incredibly reinforcing. So as you start to identify who you are and what you're going to be, then you come back and say, all right, if being all the things that I was they weren't inconsequential, but they weren't all consuming. What is left to me and what can I be now? And it starts with, I can be a person of character, because I didn't know what I'd do. I didn't know what a job I'd have. I didn't know anything that I didn't ever think I'd write a book, much less multiple books. And so I couldn't fall back on that and say, okay, I've got this great future ahead. I had this big question mark ahead. But what I could do is I could be the person that people had believed in before, to validate that, and I could be the person that they had reason to believe in the future. And that's a lot of agency to possess.
There is a lot of agency, and yet it seems like Annie, your wife, had a big role to play in validating your sense of agency. This may seem like a tangent, but I think it's especially important. It's one of the most important life decisions we probably make. Is if you can provide some advice on marriage and how you think about that in your life.
Yeah, I'll take you on a little bit of my thinking of it. First off, if we go back in the history of marriage, conditions around it affected. It was much harder to get divorced or break up years ago, hundreds of years ago. And then if we went back to 150 years ago, let's say if you were going out to homestead in Nebraska in 1870 and you're married and you may have kids, it was a very practical partnership. A single person trying to farm, particularly if they had children, was really difficult. You can't say impossible, but extraordinarily difficult because you had a practical side. So there was a love component to marriage, but there was a practical codependency. Then you go to today, and many couples are two-income families,
Mm-hmm.
and both people have the ability to go out and make their way on their own. And so we say, what's going to hold this marriage together? It's going to be love. Well, the reality in my experience is love's powerful, but it goes up and down. It waxes and wanes like the sea. And sometimes people say you meet, you fall in love, you get married,
Yeah.
you live happily ever after. And I say, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think you meet, fall in love, get married, and you work hard at it every single day if you have a hope of living happily ever after. Because marriage is really hard work. I've been married 48 years now.
Yeah.
We've been together 51, and I'm as happy today as I've ever been in that marriage. But it requires both of us to be committed. It can't be conditional. It can't be, I'm going to be married to you unless I stop liking you. Now, I'm not saying divorce or breaking up is wrong, because sometimes it's absolutely the right thing. But I think if you go into any commitment conditionally,
That's right.
it's dangerous.
You sense that today there might be a more conditional view on marriage and in a lot of other commitments, and I think that there is a certain sense of easiness and transactionalism that especially exists today that I wonder was always, if it did not exist in the past. I'm curious. You describe the concept of they a lot in the book, and you describe this notion that we often, especially political leaders, but folks throughout history, have used the concept of they to turn people against each other. I've only known a politics stand where they has been prominent. I graduated high school in 2016, and so my first election was the first President Trump election, and it seems like on both sides we use they as the way to galvanize. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not you can have a politics that doesn't have a they in it? Or is that too idealistic and in fact, in some ways, against human nature?
Politics in America and around the world have always been a potentially difficult sport, and, sort of bare knuckles. But it has gone through periods where it was much worse than other periods. So if we go before the Civil War, in the decades before the Civil War, there was a lot of disagreement about slavery. Part of it was political power, part of it was economic, part of it was moral. And it went that way up until about 1850. And then about 1850 and the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the discourse changed, and people from the North started hating people from the South just because they were those people from the South. And the same was true south to the North. You started to have a cultural divide that wasn't really based on economics or political power. It became more visceral, more animal-like. And I would argue that potentially the Civil War was inevitable after about 1851 because of that. If you fast forward ahead into times of war, one of the first things we do is dehumanize our enemy. We depict them in a way that they are, we call the Germans the Huns.
Mm-hmm.
We called the Japanese the Japs. And Bull Halsey had this famous billboard at the entrance to one of the South Pacific bases that he used that said, "Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs."
Mm.
Now, if you think about it now, we'd sort of recoil from that. But in the moment of the context, everybody said, well, great, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You do that because it's easier to hate somebody that is not human. If you say, no, my opponent is rational, honorable, and just as good as I am, they just have a different view, it's sort of hard to get the moral, righteous indignation to go kill them. And that's true at the soldier level, and it's true at the societal level. And so we have a tendency to want to paint our enemies in this darkest of hues, not only as being subhuman or evil, but as being menacing. They
Mm-hmm.
will take something away from us. They will come for our women, for our children, for our everything. And so you now see it really since you joined politics at an inopportune moment where it is more that way than it has been in quite a while. Most famously, you go back to 2008 when President Obama, then Senator Obama
Mm-hmm.
was or then President Obama was running against John McCain. And one of the people at a McCain speech
Yeah. Yeah.
said something terrible about Obama. He's a Muslim bad person. And McCain went to him and said, "No, ma'am, he's not. He's an honorable person. We disagree, but he is a good, honorable patriot." I'm not sure all of our politicians would respond as John McCain did in that moment.
Hmm.
And I think that is
Why do you think you responded that way in that moment?
because I think he was an extraordinarily values driven person. Here's a
Hmm.
person who had himself been tortured in Vietnamese prison as a prisoner of war, who had some strong feelings. John McCain was a man of passions, but he was a man that was deeply honorable and believed that certain things were right and certain things were wrong. And I think he was willing to stand up and say what he thought was right, even though in the moment it would have been more comfortable to have gone along with the crowd. He'd have probably gotten applause if he had.
Sure.
But it took values that were stronger than his sense of opportunism.
Hmm.
His values were important enough to him that he wasn't willing to give them away for a moment of applause.
And when you think about that equation of character being convictions times discipline, it almost seems like the discipline in that moment to stick to his values instead of the opportunism was much higher. And I think that that probably multiplied his character tenfold.
I think you're right. And if we look today, too many politicians will go up on TV and they'll say stuff, and they're pretty reasonable statements,
Sure.
but then you'll see them vote for something that absolutely contradicts that.
Hmm.
They will allow positions to go forward that they attach their name to that they never, they don't want to. You can see it in their eyes. They know it's bad, but they've decided that my personal opportunity is better served by allowing my discipline to be weak.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that so much now, it's dispiriting.
We actually just did an entire episode on the One Big Beautiful Bill and sort of omnibus packages and how they're constructed. Folks can actually check out the last episode. And the entire process is one in which it almost seems like, and I'm curious what your view is on this, it almost seems like we've lost our art of compromise. And so we've built these weird behemoth Frankenstein packages that then cause people to vote one way for one thing, but then their convictions violated in another way down the bill. And it all seems like it's because we just don't know how to compromise anymore. I'm curious what your view is on that.
Yeah, I'm going to call it as I see it on this. I think that's true. We don't know how to compromise, but we also have extraordinary cowardice.
Hmm.
By putting everything into one bill, that gives the person who votes for that bill the opportunity to say, I voted for it, but there were lots of things I didn't like, I didn't agree with. So
Mm-hmm.
it gives them cover to go, well, yeah, I didn't agree with that, I didn't agree with that. Actually, if we broke out all of those things into much more specific questions, then people would have to put their hand up and say,
Hmm.
I vote for or against that, and be held accountable. And so this big snowball, and it's not really snow,
Mm-hmm.
this big snowball gives them the ability to pretend that they are people of conviction when in fact they are trying to vote for it because there's some good things in there, even though there's some bad things. And I think that's not the way our republic should function.
There seems to be sort of that lack of accountability. When I was younger and did not, I still am relatively young, but when I had no idea how like Washington D.C. worked, how politics worked, one of my thoughts was, well, we just need people of more character in DC. We just need people that would be accountable in that moment. And yet, it seems like as we understand our politics more, it's less that there are good people, and you write about this in the book. It's less that there are good people in government, but it's more that oftentimes the system is one in which it churns out folks that have strong character, but then have to sacrifice their character for opportunity. How do you operate in that environment? And I'm curious if you think there are ways to address sort of that systemic challenge to people's very character.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We have corrupted the environment, so we have essentially made it almost impossible for a person to operate with real character and be effective or survive politically. And so what they do is they make a decision. They decide if they want to survive politically, if that's important enough, then they are going to give up their ability to operate with character and be effective. And so they rationalize. They go, well, Washington's a better place with me here because I'm really a good person, even
Right.
though I have to do some things that aren't good. It's an end justifies the means argument. There are some things I think we could do, although they'd be hard, and I'll cover some of them. The first thing I would do is make voting mandatory.
Okay.
And in America, nobody likes anything that's mandatory. But the
Mm-hmm.
reality is, if you want to be a citizen and you hit a certain age, I think you should have to vote. Now, I would give an opportunity to go in and vote for nobody. There'd be a box that says, I don't want to choose anyone. But the reason I would do mandatory voting is you do away with voter suppression, you do away with turnout issues. If everybody's got to vote, we get a step closer to making our democracy work. Because only 65% of our eligible
Sure.
voting population voted, which means because neither candidate, because of third party, gets 50%, you're electing a president with less than 50% of 65% of eligible voters. So you're down about 32% of
Yep.
Americans. That's, to me, that doesn't feel like real democracy.
That seems like a presidency without representation.
Well, that's exactly what it feels
Yeah.
like. And then people who don't vote still complain about the outcome. And I go, what, are you kidding me?
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
so that's the first thing I do. The next obvious thing is you've got to get people to know each other.
Mm.
And Democrats and Republicans go home every weekend because they have to. They think they've got to go home, raise money, and defend themselves against primary opponents. And so they go home. Most people leave Thursday afternoon and come back Tuesday morning. So
Right.
they run our government 3 days a week. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
not a bad job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But except they've got to do stuff all weekend to get money. But
Yep.
so I would force them.
Which is a whole nother problem set is are you really running government, or are you spending your time raising money? And that's not necessarily the people's fault. It's how the system's built.
That's right. And we are also in a gilded age now where we have disproportionately wealthy people. And I don't mean just the most wealthy, but a lot of other people with a
Sure.
ton of money have disproportionate voting power, meaning
Mm-hmm.
political power. And the reality is they have much greater sway than another voter who doesn't have that kind of ability to contribute and affect it. So we got to take the money out of politics. And
Yeah.
it's doable, but there's a lot of constituencies who want to protect it because certain people are benefit from it and certain corporations and organizations feel that they do as well. So I think right now your basic thesis at the beginning is correct. We have some people who have character going in, but you can't function in a corrupted system and remain a person of character. You
Mm-hmm.
may think you are, but the reality is if you are doing the things necessary to survive and get anything done, you're mortgaging it. And I'll tell that to anybody to their face.
And we see, I mean, I see that all the time in the podcasting and the media world. And again, our day job is running a national organization that's focused on helping students have dialogues and conversations. But you see this when you're building a media company or an organization. And we call this the outreach industrial complex. It's this idea that outrage is what sells. And so there's a certain line of questions here that I know I can ask you, General, that will evoke a certain type of clip. And that's the way the system is built. And then we know that that'll lead to virality. Or I can actually ask you the questions I want to know about and I want to learn about, and I know our audience will learn about, which I know won't go viral. And that's the system. Um, the question is, how do you execute within that system? Because you're someone that has a whole career of figuring out ways to execute when the odds are stacked against you. I'm curious what your advice would be to an elected representative that is going into that system, trying to hold on to their character and convictions when they know they might have to rationalize.
I don't know what to tell them, because I talk to a lot
Mhm.
of young people
Yep.
about that, because they ask me, should I go? And I'm conflicted, because on the one hand, there are people I admire, and I say, I want people like you in government, but I don't want you to become the kind of person that I think there's a great chance you will. There's
Mhm.
one individual who 4 or 5 years ago, I was asked by a friend of his, he was coming out of the military, would I speak to him? And I said, sure. And so we did a call, and I said, well, tell me what you're going to do. And he says, I'm going to be this kind of a politician. This is where I'm going to function. I said, what about when you're under this intense pressure to do this? What are you going to do? He says, I'm not going to be that kind of politician. I'm going to be the kind I described.
Mhm.
And I said, okay, well, we'll talk again. And we talked again, and he had moved down the spectrum already.
Yep.
And he said, can we talk, and would you support me? And I said, no, you've already moved away from the character that you described. And then he got himself elected, and now he's in an appointed position,
Hmm.
and he is way over the line. He is exactly what he swore to me he would never be.
Mhm.
And on the one hand, I go, wow, Stan, you're smart because you saw it coming. But I don't feel smart. I feel sad,
Mhm.
because you didn't have to be smart to see it coming. And I presume that he is a good guy, or was a good guy. But now I don't have that confidence.
I heard you say this because I almost feel like this conversation is going in a direction where it's like we aspire to have better character in our country, we aspire to have better leadership, and yet the system grinds folks out. Um, and at the start of your book tour, where you went on Jon Stewart and you talked about how you wanted to start a conversation around character, and you went on a lot of different shows, and in fact, yesterday my friend saw you on, I think it was Hassan Minaj's podcast, someone else's. So I'm curious, in the tour that you've been on, where you've wanted to start a conversation, what has been your biggest frustration as you've gone on this tour, and what has been your biggest point of optimism or sense of hope?
Yeah, that's a thoughtful question, and thanks. And let me give you a preamble. For more than a decade, I've been involved in the national service movement, trying to get civilian national service as a
Yeah.
realistic option for young Americans.
And I'm now on the board of the Service Year Alliance. So
God bless you. You know,
we'll carry the torch forward.
yeah, and my biggest frustration with that is that while people agree with you in principle, they won't take the political steps to actually support it to the level that I think it should be supported. They won't make the tough decisions. They will simply be theoretically for it, but they won't allocate the money or make tough calls. I feel sort of the same way about wider issues of the conversational character. I've gotten an extraordinary response to it in the positive. But when I say, okay, where does this go?
Yep.
Then people will go, well, it will just be another conversation, and it will be like a branch falling in the woods. If nobody hears it, it didn't happen. And I don't think that has to be the case, because I don't think it has to be a series of very small conversations. When I talk about a conversation on character, I'm talking in the broad sense that we should have character as part of almost every conversation. So,
Mhm.
for example, if a politician is running for office, maybe the question they get asked is, okay, candidate, describe your character and support it with facts about you that convince me that your character is what you're claiming it is.
Hmm.
And don't make it debates on, the cleverest comeback. Make it somebody having to stand up and not in a short one-liner. Give them 10 minutes to talk about their character. And if they can't talk about their character for 10 minutes, then maybe there's not enough character to elect. So when I talk about the conversation on character, it should be a metric on everything we judge on people and on organizations. When we say, what is the United States position? Well, what is our character? Can people trust our country? Can people desire to emulate our country? So I think what we're trying to do is raise the idea that that really is what matters. And it's not whether the person or the country has a lot of power or wealth.
It's interesting to think about character as a metric. And I guess one of the things you describe is in that answer is, hey, maybe every time we ask folks a question or you talk to candidates or there's a presidential debate, ask them, okay, what is your character? That's one way I could see us holding this accountable. I'm curious, is there a way, have you thought about how to get the average American to actually hold character accountable on the ballot box, when it comes to primaries? And I'll just give you some context on this question. Part of the reason why the show is called The Hopeful Majority and why I think about Bridge in the long run is that my view is that you have sort of extreme voices on both sides electing folks in the early part of the primary, so 10% of the population showing up. And so the candidates that get filtered through are people that have been filtered through the extremes. So as a result, they're not, again, testing for character, they're testing for ideological conviction. So the thinking is, how do you get the majority of people that believe in open-minded conversations to show up earlier in the process so that that's the candidate that you had filtered through? Have you thought a little bit about how you can get character to be filtered through earlier in the process?
Yeah, not as deeply as I'd like to think about it, but I will. Some things I've been thinking recently.
Sure.
One of the things that has eroded in our country is local media.
Yep.
And local media used to provide a very grassroots way of vetting candidates because closer to the candidate, ability to drill in on them. And somebody used the example to me. They goes, had there been more viable local media, George Santos, that Congress member from Long Island,
The illustrious fella.
yeah, he would never have been elected had there been a vigorous local media to really focus on him. And yet national level media is never going to spend the time or resources to go down and do that kind of a vetting. So I think that's one way. I'm also intrigued by the idea that artificial intelligence could do something that I hadn't thought about before. It could start to look at a candidate's background. It could look at it through the lens of character. It could look at it through the lens of almost everything, because the ability to do that, their veracity. Um, and if artificial intelligence is viewed as credible, i.e., it evolves
Yep.
to the point where we put value on what it says, it's kind of a third party validator. And the analogy I'd used, they're going to go to electronic balls and strikes in Major League Baseball
Yep.
because the machine can do it perfectly. What if AI could do that? What if Manu runs for office and AI just goes down and says, "Can you believe him? Here you go. Let's take a look."
Yeah, this guy doesn't belong anywhere near the stump.
There you go. And,
Yeah.
but maybe that's another way to make up for the fact that so much of our media has gotten weakened or is inherently biased.
There's a lot of interesting thought around that idea. The challenge that I've seen with AI is, again, the caveat that you put in there, which is if it becomes a trusted entity, which is a big if. But here's sort of how I would think about this is as our generation sort of evolves and thinks through this is, uh, you know, there's a lot of people now coming up where they see their pathway to power, especially in politics, as one that is sort of the Zoran Mamdani path, which is you basically game the social media system and you do it really effectively and you succeed on that lens. Um, that system to me is one that doesn't seem to be testing for character. That system seems to be, again, one that tests for veracity, conviction, you and so I'm thinking again, what is the system? What is the mechanism that tests for character that is built in that way? And I keep coming back to this question of maybe there's a way for people to reward different types of content on social media. Maybe it's a question of, we vote with our feet. You also like with your feet. What do you like and what type of content are you engaging? Do you have you found as you've gone through this public tour and as you've talked about this book, have you found there to be uptick in sort of the average people as it comes to that conversation? And then I'm sure you've wondered, are these hosts actually listening to me? Are they actually exercising these character questions once I'm off this episode?
Yeah. Interestingly, I found the hosts being more interested than in anything I've ever done,
Okay.
and being almost desirous of trying to make this idea get propagated in a very good way. I was really elated by that. And I knew I've been on some of these before.
Yep.
And so I have a comparison. And so the reality is they really want to propagate it, but I think they're struggling with exactly how do you do that?
Yeah. And they lose eyeballs if they focus in.
I'd offer a thought. We learn to judge people. Think of someone you've developed a relationship with, or you're going to hire for a business, or you're going to go work for. We learn directly and indirectly to look at a resume, for example, to look at their social media. And those are both things that they have put together to tell the story that they want told.
That's right.
In the military, you used to also be able to look at their record. And there were some things you learned to do. You learned to look at their progression of jobs. Did they work for the same person more than once, which usually indicate that they could be trusted? There are lots of different, things that are markers for positive character. And then, of course, you ask people, you go to people you trust, and you say, can I trust that person? And usually you could get a pretty straight response because people wanted to protect their credibility. I think we're going to have to find versions of that in our society where we can go to people and we can say, this is the brand that this person has created. How do we then go and find out what's behind the brand? What's the reality? And we've done very poorly at it in the last few elections because we've been willing to say everything behind the brand doesn't really matter. Their personal life, we don't care. Their values, we don't care. But I think we could get around to where we say we want to weigh those. It doesn't mean that we will disqualify someone because they've made a mistake in life. I don't think we can do that. But we're going to judge them holistically and realistically and not two-dimensionally.
It's almost like I hear you describing the LinkedIn of character. You've got some sort of again, socially, because it's got to be socially credible and it's got to be a way to propagate it and it's got to be something that people accept. I'm mindful of our time. I want to ask you one last question. I was actually just rereading this passage while you were giving your final answer. I was rereading your epilogue, and when I read your epilogue the first time, it was actually quite emotional. I was contemplating in my own life, and one of the things that I oftentimes do is thinking about the exercise that you've given, which is writing your obituary or walking through a cemetery, contemplating on life, meditating on death. And so there's this final passage that you describe here, where you describe again your funeral happening at Arlington Cemetery, so you're being laid to rest, and you discuss, once the family and old guard soldiers depart, the grave will be filled in. Several weeks later, after cemetery officials ensure the inscription is correct, the headstone will be placed. More frequent at first, then only rarely, family members will come. And you go on in the final two sentences to say, life continues, and if each of us lives by our convictions, I believe it will be better for us having lived. How would you describe how you've lived?
Well, of course, like everybody, imperfectly, but I think my life has been increasingly coherent. And I use that word carefully because early in my career, I thought what I wanted to be was a soldier. And then I thought maybe I'd like to be a great soldier. And as I go on in life, I realize what I really want to be is a good person. I want to be that person that people will judge in a way that says they were a worthy human being. And you realize that all of the other metrics don't matter much. And even that metric, because the people who do care about us are all going to die, so we can't think about our legacy. What we have to think about is our value in the moment, and then our contribution to things going forward that'll be forgotten, but will matter. And so, that's the way I think about it. And I never would have expected to.
Well, I can say one thing, which is I've read most of your books, and I remember reading your memoir, and I thought, wow, this is really imprinting. But one thing I can say is I think the final book that you've written on character has actually had the biggest impact on me, and I think again that speaks to the fact that we probably wouldn't have been talking about John McCain if he had given a different answer in that moment. It was the answer of character. He sacrificed opportunism, but we're talking about him because he leveraged character, and I think. That there's a importance to that I personally take home when I think about my actions. So I appreciate the conversation, General, and thank you for making the time.
Well, stop calling me General. And Manu, thanks for all you're doing.
All the best, Dan. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We appreciate your time. Every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we're building the hopeful majority of strong character people, and maybe someone here listening will build the LinkedIn of character, Stan.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you, everyone.